Hello, everybody. Today we're going to take a look at The Forsaken Wife by Elizabeth Thomas, who writes under the pseudonym of Corinna. So we'll start by taking a look at some of the historical context. So Thomas lived from 1675 to 1731, and she publishes this poem in 1722. I think the important historical context to understand when we're writing about this poem is the way that women were seen and treated, including from a legal perspective. And I think that's particularly relevant to the second half of the poem. So Thomas sent a couple of her poems to the English poet John Dryden. John Dryden was a very famous English poet, and he was actually Britain's first poet laureate, which tells you that he was absolutely endorsed by the establishment. Now Dryden sent back two of her poems and said to Thomas in a letter, quote, "Your verses were, I thought, too good to be a woman's." So that shows the kind of sexism that prevailed at the time. I'd also focus on a legal doctrine in 18th century England known as coverture. Now, according to the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman, known as a femme covert, by marrying a man, lost many of her legal rights. So a married woman wasn't able to keep her own salary, wasn't able to own property, wasn't able to sign legal documents, as well as forfeiting other legal rights. Now, this quote on my screen is from a 1765 book. Bearing in mind, this is over 40 years after the publication of the poem. So it shows how little progress is being made. Now, this book is the William Blackstone text, Commentaries on the Laws of England. And the quote goes, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage." So that goes to show the kind of unequal treatment that wives faced compared to their husbands. And I think that is relevant to the poem, as we'll see. Now let's go into the poem. So the poem is, I think, a very clear expression of anger and resentment from a wife to her husband for cheating on her. And that sixth line goes, "Your infidelity I find," and that means cheating. So I would focus on a few things. The first thing that I'm interested in is the fact that this poem is very much addressed to her husband. Now, the second person pronoun you or your appears 8 times in this poem. And it's very clear that the speaker, she wants to address her husband directly and she wants him to hear and listen. Now, this technique is known as apostrophe. If a poem is written to someone, if it says you or thee, then it means it's addressed to someone. And you can say that the poet uses apostrophe. Okay? The second thing I would focus on is the kind of syntactic parallel that runs in the two lines. Line 2, one pitying look, one parting word. And then line 8, my broken heart, your broken vows. So you see in both these lines the repetition of the structure of the line, one this, one that. And then in the 8th line, the repetition of broken. Okay, so the repetition of one in line 2 and the repetition of broken in line 8 is emphasizing her feeling of heartbreak and anger at her husband. The second thing I would talk about in these two lines is the use of plosive alliteration. So plosive alliteration is the repetition of P or B, and it's a harsh sound. It's potentially an angry sound, and I think it's being done to draw attention to her anger. What I would do is I would take these quotes together. So in one paragraph, I would write about both of these lines because they both do the same things to achieve the same effect. The next line that I would focus on is the first line of the second stanza. Cruel man, I am not blind. I think there's loads of good language analysis to do in this line. The first thing to say is look at the exclamation mark. That's clearly there to show her anger, as well as the adjective cruel. She is trying to draw attention to how cruel he has been. Look at the fact that she describes him as man. She might be so angry that she can't even say his name and can only bring herself to describe him as man. Look at the fact that every single word in this line is only one syllable. She uses monosyllabic language because when you're angry, you can barely get the words out. You're not looking to use long lines. You can barely get the words out through your anger. The use of monosyllabic language is being used, but also, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, notice that this line is shorter than all of the other lines in the poem. All of the other lines in the poem follow an 8-syllable iambic tetrameter meter. 8 syllables, but this line is hypometric. This line is shorter than the others. Cruel man, I am not blind. And it's the same thing as the monosyllabic language. She's so angry that she can barely get words out of her mouth. Such is her fury at her husband. So for me, that's a great quote to pick because there's so much language analysis that you can do. The next quote I would focus on is this first line of the final stanza, show me a man that dare be true. Notice again the use of monosyllabic language to show her anger, but also the use of this imperative verb, show me. This phrase, imperative phrase, show me, she's not kindly asking her husband to do something, she's telling him. She doesn't have any patience for him. She's telling him what to do because she's angry at him. Notice also in this line that she makes a universal claim about men. She says to the subject, her husband, find me any man who is able, who dares to be true. So here she makes a universal criticism of men, and this is where I would make a link to the historical context of the mistreatment and the unequal treatment of women in 18th century England. And I'd be referring to things like coverture and the response she gets from poet laureate John Dryden. The last thing I would focus on is this phrase, my dear adieu. And I think this is a very triumphant ending because she says goodbye. She walks away. She escapes the toxic relationship. And we as readers get a sense of satisfaction that she's able to walk away, contrary perhaps to our expectations of a time when women seem to be trapped and subservient within relationships. And this use of my dear is triumphantly ironic. She doesn't mean my dear. Clearly, she has little love left for her husband. She says, my dear, and there's a kind of victory there. The last thing I would talk about, because I think I've got 5 things I'd like to focus on, is the structure. Now, what I would say is that this poem follows a regular structure. And there are 2 things that make it regular. One is the use of rhyming couplets. If you look at those last words, afford, word, due, you, blind, find, we have these rhyming couplets throughout. But the other thing is the use of iambic tetrameter. So every line other than cruel man, I am not blind, which I've said is hypometric, every line is 8 syllables and consists of 4 iambs. So it follows this regular rhythm, methinks 'tis strange you can't afford. So this use of iambic meter plus the use of rhyming couplets combines to create a sense of her conviction in her beliefs. She is confident that she is right. She is confident in her belief that her husband has done her wrong, crucially. So I think there's a nice structural point to be made there, and what I would do is I would attach it to the end of one of my main paragraphs. And I think that's everything we need to cover this poem.